Hello and welcome. Today let's go through this really fascinating system we call the endocrine system. Now when we talk about the endocrine system, we'll see the endocrine system's organs are all going to be found scattered everywhere throughout the body, so there's no one location where we can say they're all right here. And we'll go through and review all that as we go through the chapter. Now, first, when we talk about the endocrine system we'll see is going to act with the nervous system. They regulate the activity of other organs over long distances, and they will do that by their own special ways. When we talk endocrine system, it will use hormones, and we'll talk about hormones in a few seconds. When we talk nervous system, the nervous system we saw used action potentials, graded potentials, right? Now, they will also coordinate and integrate the activity of our body's cells. Now, when we talked nervous system acting its own special way, again, we talked about electrical voltage there. The nervous system we saw in the previous chapter used neurons. It used neurons to regulate the activity of other neurons, muscles, and glands. And it regulated their activity via electrochemical impulses very rapidly within milliseconds. Now, when we talk about the endocrine system, we'll see the endocrine system is going to influence the body's metabolic activity by using hormones, we said. Hormones are chemical messengers, or you can think of them as chemical signals. And they're going to be secreted by the cells of our endocrine glands, and they're going to be secreted into the extracellular fluid. So basically, they're secreted out of the cell. And once they're out of the cell, they're going to make their way into the blood, and they're going to be transported in the blood. We have endothelin, which is going to make its way through the lymph. But we're going to really focus on these ones that are traveling through the blood here in this chapter. Next, then we'll see these messengers, they'll travel long distances through the blood, or the lymph as we mentioned, and they're going to regulate the metabolic function. So when we're talking metabolic function, we're talking about the chemical reactions, the physiology, or the behavior of other cells in the body. Particularly fascinating is the fact that they regulate the cells of distant organs. When a hormone binds to a cellular receptor, it initiates responses in the cell, and these responses occur within seconds, or they can take a few days to occur. Hormones target most cells in the body, and they produce widespread and diverse effects. Some processes that they integrate and they control are going to include, we can see, reproduction, growth and development, maintenance of electrolytes, the maintenance of water, the maintenance of nutrient balance in our blood. They're also responsible for the regulation of cellular metabolism and energy balance. Also, they control and integrate the mobilization of body defenses. We'll see the endocrine system compared to the nervous system orchestrates processes that go on for long periods, and sometimes they can go on continuously. So the response is slower, but it's longer lasting compared to the nervous system. In the nervous system, we saw the response is again occurring almost immediately. However, it's not of a long duration. So here we have the response. It's a little slower, but it's longer lasting than compared to what the nervous system would give. So next then, we can look at the definition of endocrinology. Now when we talk endocrinology is going to be the scientific study of hormones and the endocrine organs. An endocrinologist we'll see is going to be a physician that studies the endocrine organs and the hormones. Next, then, we can see, unlike most organ systems, the endocrine system organs are not grouped together. They're scattered basically everywhere throughout the body. Now, here we can see our glands get classified into two major classifications. We have first exocrine glands and we have endocrine glands. Now, our exocrine glands are going to be glands that are going to be secreting non-hormonal substances, such as sweat and saliva. And when these glands secrete their secretions into ducts. And these ducts then are going to take those secretions into a cavity or onto a surface. And now when we talk endocrine glands, our endocrine glands are going to be glands that produce hormones. And these glands, they do not have ducts. And when they secrete their secretions, they're going to secrete their secretions we saw into the extracellular fluid and then eventually into the bloodstream. Endocrine glands then will be the glands that we're going to focus on in this chapter. So here we can appreciate a whole bunch of different endocrine glands. We can see we've got the pituitary gland, the pineal gland, the hypothalamus, the thyroid gland, the parathyroid glands, the thymus, the adrenal glands, we've got the pancreas, and then we've got the oviducts, the testes and the ovaries. All right, next then let's talk about our neuroendocrine organs. Now when we talk neuroendocrine organs, these are going to be organs that have neural functions and also produce and release hormones. We'll see the hypothalamus is considered the master neuroendocrine gland. However, we have several other glands that also have neuroendocrine cells, such as the pituitary gland, the adrenal medulla, to name a couple there. And we'll also see several organs such as the pancreas, the gonads, and the placenta. They contain exocrine tissue and endocrine tissue, so we consider them mixed glands. And then we can see we also have other tissues and organs that are going to produce hormones and have their own functions, such as adipose cells, the thymus, the cells in the walls of the small intestine we can see, the stomach, the kidneys, and the heart. So when we were looking here at this picture of these various organs, you can see the kidneys are there as well. So again, we can appreciate the majority of those endocrine organs right inside of here. Next then, let's move through and let's look at the endocrine system then in greater detail. So first here we can see we've got hormones. Hormones we said are long distance chemical signals that are going to travel in the blood or in the lymph. Now during the endocrine system, we also look at local chemical messengers. They're going to be classified into two major groups, autocrines and paracrines. They're going to be short distance signals. A lot of endocrinologists don't even consider them here because endocrinology, we're looking at long distance signals. So here we've got autocrines. Autocrines are going to be chemicals that are going to exert their effects on the same cells that secrete them. For example, we have prostaglandins. Prostaglandins are going to be released by smooth muscle cells, and they also are going to affect them too. Next then we have our paracrines. When we talk our paracrines, they're going to act locally, meaning within the same tissue. So they act locally, but they affect cell types other than those that are releasing the paracrine chemicals. Basically, they're going to affect the neighboring cell types. For example, delta cells. Delta cells of the pancreas, they produce somatostatin. And somatostatin, it inhibits another population of cells, the beta cells, that are going to be responsible for producing insulin. So autocrines, we can see chemicals that exert effects on the same cells that secrete them. Paracrines, locally acting chemicals that affect cells other than those that secrete them. Now, autocrines and paracrines are local chemical messengers. They're not considered a part of the endocrine system, I told you. All right, next then let's move to the chemistry of our hormones. Now, when we talk about the chemistry of our hormones, hormones are classified as either number 1, amino acid-based hormones, number 2, steroid-based hormones, and then third classification we have there is our eicosanoids. Now, when we talk amino acid-based hormones, we'll see here most hormones are going to be amino acid-based. The size of the hormones will vary from simple amino acid derivatives to peptides to proteins. Now, when we talk simple amino acid derivatives, this will include our catecholamines dopamine, epinephrine, and norepinephrine, which are going to be constructed from tyrosine. And then we have our peptides. When we talk peptides, these are going to be short chains of amino acids. And we talk proteins. Proteins we'll see are going to be long chains then of amino acids. The second classification then are our steroids. When we talk steroids, these hormones are going to be synthesized from cholesterol. And examples will include gonadotropins and adrenocortical hormones. And then we talk our third class we can see are our eicosanoids. These are going to be signaling molecules that are going to be made from arachidonic acid or other polyunsaturated fatty acids. Eicosanoids will include our leukotrienes, it will include prostaglandins, and third, thromboxanes. Leukotrienes, they're going to mediate inflammation and some allergic reactions. When we talk prostaglandins, prostaglandins are going to have multiple effects ranging from increasing blood pressure to expulsive uterine contractions, all the way to enhancing blood clotting, pain, and inflammation. We'll see some researchers are going to add these as a third class because they act as autocrines and paracrines. They don't influence distant targets like hormones do. All right, next then let's look at our eicosanoids being formed. So here we can see tyrosine, and here we have oxygen. Oxygen will come in and combine with tyrosine, and tyrosine is going to be acted on by tyrosine hydroxylase, which will convert it to L-DOPA. And then here we can see we'll have L-DOPA formed. L-DOPA then gets acted on by dopa decarboxylase, which then becomes dopamine, and we can see carbon dioxide is released. Dopamine then is acted on by dopamine beta hydroxylase, which converts dopamine to norepinephrine. And then norepinephrine is going to be acted on by phenylethanolamine and methyltransferase, PNMT it's also known as, to form epinephrine. Next, then let's move down to the mechanisms of hormone action. Now, I'd like you to know, though hormones circulate systemically, only cells with receptors for that hormone are going to be affected. It's kind of like our keys here we'll see. Okay, so again, hormones only bind to and influence the activity of those cells that have receptors for it. These are its target cells. These are its target cells. Hormones are going to alter target cell activity by increasing or by decreasing the rate of cell processes. The precise response is going to depend on the target cells. For example, we'll see epinephrine. Epinephrine is going to bind smooth muscle cells in our blood vessel walls, causing them to constrict. And when it binds to other cells, we'll see it's going to have a totally different effect. For example, in the airways, it causes smooth muscle relaxation. So like we mentioned, hormones are going to alter target cell activity. And some of those activities can include, as we can see here, altering plasma membrane permeability and or membrane potential by opening or closing ion channels. Hormones can also stimulate the synthesis of enzymes or other proteins. Hormones can activate or deactivate enzymes. Hormones can induce the secretory activity, and they can also stimulate mitosis. Now, when hormones act, we'll see hormones are going to act on receptors a couple of different ways. So here we could see this will depend on their chemical nature and the receptor's location. So we can see here we have water-soluble hormones and we have lipid-soluble hormones. First, let's talk water-soluble hormones. When we talk water-soluble hormones, this will include all amino acid hormones except for thyroid hormone. These hormones can't enter cells, so they're going to act on the receptors that are found in the plasma membrane. These receptors are usually coupled via G protein to one or more intracellular second messengers, which will then mediate the target cell's response. So here we can see that in this figure right inside of here. Here we can see our hormones going to be our first messenger, and it will bind to the receptor. And when it binds to the receptor, we can see the receptor then is going to activate our G protein. our G protein gets activated, and the G protein then activates adenylate cyclase. Adenylate cyclase then converts ATP to cyclic AMP, and cyclic AMP, we've seen before, is our second messenger. And then we can see cyclic AMP can activate protein kinases. So then this triggers responses of the target cells. And the responses, we said, can include activating enzymes or stimulating cellular secretion or even opening ion channels. So here then we can see some hormones that will act via cyclic AMP mechanisms. Epinephrine, ACTH, FSH, LH, glucagon, PTH, TSH, and calcitonin. Next then let's check out our lipid-soluble hormones. This will include steroid and thyroid hormones. These hormones, these lipid-soluble hormones, they will act on receptors inside the cell, which then directly activates genes. So here we could see that right inside of here. So here we've got our steroid hormones. The steroid hormones are going to be able to cross the plasma membrane, and they make their way to the inside where they find the receptor. And now here we have our receptor hormone complex formed. And then here you can see that enters the nucleus. And when it enters the nucleus, the receptor hormone complex is going to bind to a hormone response element. And the binding will initiate transcription of the gene to mRNA. And the mRNA, we've seen, directs protein synthesis. So moving back, then we can see we talked first our water-soluble hormones. And then here we can see everything in relation to the second messenger system. Right? This is everything we saw there right inside this picture. And then with our steroid hormones, we saw everything here. Let's move to then the control of hormone release. Now, when we talk about the control of hormone release, I'd like you to know about endocrine gland stimuli. There are 3 types of stimuli that will trigger endocrine glands to manufacture and release their hormones. And they'll include humoral stimuli, number 2, neural stimuli, and number 3, hormonal stimuli. Let's talk first humoral stimuli. When we talk humoral stimuli are going to be the simplest endocrine controls. When we have a decline of a certain hormone, it gets detected in the blood and more of it is going to be produced. For example, we can see that with PTH, insulin, and with aldosterone. So here we can see with PTH, if calcium in the blood is declining, these declining blood calcium concentrations are going to stimulate our parathyroid glands to secrete PTH, parathyroid hormone. And then parathyroid hormone gets released, and parathyroid hormone is going to cause calcium concentrations to rise, and the stimulus then gets removed. So here we can see humoral stimuli with PTH. The stimulus for PTH's release is going to be low concentration of calcium. And then the response is the parathyroid glands are going to secrete PTH, and PTH is going to help increase blood calcium levels. Next in here we can see neural stimuli. When we talk neural stimuli also stimulate hormone release. For example, in response to stress, the sympathetic nervous system is going to stimulate the adrenal medulla to secrete epinephrine and norepinephrine. So when we talk neural stimuli, you can see hormone release is caused by neural input. The stimulus is going to be action potentials in the preganglionic sympathetic fibers to the adrenal medulla. And now we know the adrenal medulla is going to release epinephrine and norepinephrine, our stress hormones. And the response we can see then is going to be by the adrenal medulla cells. The adrenal medulla cells are going to secrete epinephrine and norepinephrine. And then the third type is going to be hormonal stimuli. Here we'll see hormones are going to influence the release and manufacture of other hormones. For example, we can see our hypothalamic hormones. They're going to stimulate the release of most anterior pituitary hormones. And then when we talk anterior pituitary hormones, they're going to stimulate target cells to secrete still more hormones. And then here we can see we also have a hypothalamic pituitary target endocrine organ feedback loop. Here we'll see the hormones from the final target organs are going to be able to inhibit the release of anterior pituitary hormones. So here we can see the hypothalamus will stimulate the anterior pituitary gland, and the anterior pituitary gland then influences these other glands, which then influence other organs. So here you can see the stimulus is going to be hormones from the hypothalamus. And then the response is the anterior pituitary gland is going to secrete hormones that stimulate other endocrine glands to secrete hormones. So this is hormonal stimulus. And here we can see all three stimuli. Next then, let's move to our first endocrine organ. And we will talk about our pituitary gland, and we'll also talk here the hypothalamus. Now when we talk pituitary gland, the pituitary gland is also known as the hypophysis. And the pituitary gland is going to be divided into two major lobes. You have first the anterior pituitary and the posterior pituitary, or you can say the anterior lobe and the posterior lobe. Now we can see here the posterior pituitary is going to be made up of neural tissue. It's neural tissue, not glandular tissue. When we talk anterior pituitary, the anterior pituitary, also known as the adenohypophysis, is made up of glandular tissue. So the anterior pituitary is a true endocrine gland. The posterior pituitary we see is not. The pituitary gland, if you recall from anatomy, is going to be found securely seated in the sella turcica of the sphenoid bone. The gland is about the size and the shape of a pea. It's more accurately described as a pea on a stalk. The stalk is better known as the infundibulum, and we can see here it's found right inside of here. And it's going to be connecting the gland to the hypothalamus superiorly. So it connects this pituitary gland to the hypothalamus we see right up in here superiorly. The pituitary gland, again, has two major lobes, and we can appreciate the posterior lobe being highlighted here. And here we have the anterior lobe. Again, one lobe we said is neural tissue and the other is glandular tissue. The posterior pituitary is made up of neural tissue. It releases neurohormones, hormones that are going to be secreted by neurons. So it releases neurohormones. And they're made from neurons whose cell bodies are found located in the hypothalamus. The posterior pituitary, or the posterior lobe, we can say, is a hormone storage area and not a true endocrine gland that manufactures hormones. The anterior pituitary, or the adenohypophysis, we said is composed of glandular tissue, and it manufactures and releases a number of hormones. Next then, let's look at the pituitary-hypothalamic relationships. Now here we can see the posterior lobe is actually a part of the brain. It derives from a downgrowth of hypothalamic tissue, and it maintains its neural connection with the hypothalamus via a nerve bundle that's called the hypothalamic hypophyseal tract. This tract is going to run through the infundibulum, and we can see that here very nicely. So there's that tract. Again, we've defined the term tract, so you should have that understanding there. And here you can see it's running through the infundibulum. The tract arises from neurons in the paraventricular and supraoptic nuclei of the hypothalamus. You can see that there very clearly. The cell bodies of the paraventricular neurons primarily make oxytocin. And then the cell bodies of the supraoptic neurons or nuclei are going to produce antidiuretic hormone, ADH. Let's actually look at the posterior pituitary and the hypothalamic hormones here. Now, when we talk about this posterior pituitary and the hypothalamic hormones, let's look at oxytocin first. Oxytocin is a strong stimulant of uterine contraction, and it's going to be released in higher amounts during childbirth and in nursing women. We'll see as oxytocin levels rise, the expulsive contractions of labor by the smooth muscles of the uterus gain momentum and end in birth. Oxytocin also acts as the hormonal trigger for milk ejection. In women whose breasts are producing milk in response to prolactin. Oxytocin's release, if you recall, is an example of a positive feedback mechanism. Next, then, let's look at ADH, antidiuretic hormone. ADH is also known as vasopressin. ADH is a substance that inhibits or it prevents urine formation, and it prevents a wide swing in our water balance, helping the body to avoid dehydration and water overload. You will see that you have osmoreceptors. They're basically your hypothalamic neurons, and they're going to monitor the solute concentration and thus the water concentration of our blood. Now, when solute concentrations increase, osmoreceptors excite hypothalamic neurons, which then are going to release ADH. Now, released into the blood by the posterior pituitary, ADH, or antidiuretic hormone or vasopressin, targets the kidney's tubules. Then the tubule cells will respond then by reabsorbing more water from the urine and returning it to the bloodstream. As a result, less urine is going to be produced and the solute concentration of the blood is going to decline. Now, as solute levels fall, the osmoreceptors stop depolarizing, ending ADH's release. So if we break down the term diuresis, diuresis is the production of urine by removing water from the body. Antidiuresis, antidiuretic hormone, is not going to allow water to leave from the body. So we can see when ADH is released, we said, as a result, less urine is going to be produced. Antidiuretic hormone. I want you guys to know drinking alcohol or lots of water inhibits ADH release. With drinking too much alcohol, you see it has hangover effects. Those hangover effects include dry mouth, intense thirst. This all shows alcohol's dehydrating effects. Next, I would like you to know about diuretic drugs. Diuretic drugs are going to antagonize the effects of ADH, and they're going to flush water from your body. Diuretics, we'll see, are going to be used to manage cases of hypertension and edema, which is water retention. And that's typical in congestive heart failure. And then last, we can see here, during hemorrhage, what we call severe blood loss, large amounts of ADH are released. And this is going to lead to vasoconstriction of your visceral blood vessels, which helps to raise blood pressure. So here then we can see the synthesis and the release of ADH and oxytocin. So first, again, our paraventricular and supraoptic nuclei, they're going to get stimulated. The hypothalamic neurons then are going to synthesize oxytocin or ADH. Oxytocin and ADH are going to be transported down the axons. Okay, so they're making their way down the axon. So here's the cell body, there's the dendrites, and that's the same thing here. That's what we call these nuclei. If you recall from anatomy, nuclei are clusters of cell bodies. Tracts are bundles of axons in the CNS. But if we're talking about bundles of axons in the PNS, then we're talking about, very good, nerves. And if we're talking nuclei, collections of nuclei in the PNS, what are we talking about? Ganglia. Ganglia, very good. Second, then we can see oxytocin and ADH are going to be transported down the axons of the hypothalamic hypophyseal tract to the posterior pituitary. And now here, ADH and oxytocin are going to be stored in the axon terminals of that posterior pituitary. And then when hypothalamic neurons fire, action potentials arriving at the axon terminals are going to cause oxytocin and ADH to be released into the blood. All right, from here then let's move over to the anterior pituitary gland. Now let's talk the anterior lobe. When we talk anterior pituitary hormones, we'll see the anterior pituitary gland produces hormones that are going to regulate the activity of other endocrine glands. However, this gland is going to be under the control of the hypothalamus. So again, this gland is going to be under the control of the hypothalamus. The pituitary secretes the proper hormones in response to specific releasing hormones that are going to come from the hypothalamus. We'll see the hypothalamus and the pituitary are connected to one another via the hypophyseal portal system. So here we can appreciate that system and the three components of the system, the primary capillary plexus and the secondary capillary plexus, and between the two, the hypophyseal portal veins. So releasing hormones will be released from the hypothalamus. They're going to travel through the portal veins to the anterior pituitary, where they're going to stimulate or inhibit the release of hormones that are going to be made by the anterior pituitary. So third, then we can see in response to releasing hormones, the anterior pituitary secretes hormones into the secondary plexus. This in turn empties into the general circulation. So let's look at the anterior pituitary hormones. You can see here we've got a nice list of each of these hormones. Now when we talk about these hormones, they're all proteins. All except growth hormone are going to activate cyclic AMP second messenger systems as their targets. TSH, ACTH, FSH, we're going to see an LH are all tropic hormones. That means they regulate the secretory action of other endocrine glands. So let's look at first growth hormone, also known as GH or somatotropin. We'll see it's going to be produced by the somatotropic cells of the anterior pituitary. It's going to have direct actions on metabolism and indirect actions on metabolism as well. And we can see all of that here in this picture. So here you can see all the direct actions. The direct actions of growth hormone are going to be on fat and carbohydrate metabolism. Where on fat, we can see it increases fat breakdown and release. And we talk carbohydrate metabolism. Growth hormone is going to increase blood glucose and other anti-insulin effects. Now, when we look at the indirect actions of growth hormone, we'll see they're growth promoting. They're going to be on liver and other tissues. And growth hormone will cause these organs to produce IGFs, insulin-like growth factors. And then here are the effects that IGFs will have on the skeletal tissue. It'll cause increased cartilage formation and skeletal growth. On extraskeletal tissue, it's going to cause increased protein synthesis and cell growth and proliferation. So when we go back then, you can see here when we talk direct actions on metabolism, we've got taken care of there. And then indirect actions, we've taken care of there as well. Next then, let's look at the regulation of secretion. We'll see the secretion of growth hormone is going to be regulated by two hypothalamic hormones with antagonistic effects. First, we have growth hormone releasing hormone, abbreviated as GHRH as we can see, and it's going to stimulate growth hormone's release, while growth hormone inhibiting hormone, or GHIH, or it's also known as somatostatin, are going to inhibit its release. Ghrelin is going to be a hunger hormone, and it's produced by the stomach, and it also stimulates growth hormone's release. GHIH, growth hormone inhibiting hormone's release, is going to be triggered by the feedback of growth hormone and IGFs. Rising levels of growth hormone also feed back to inhibit its own release. Next, let's talk hyper and hyposecretion. If we talk hypersecretion, in children, too much growth hormone being released can cause gigantism. Now, if growth hormone is secreted after the epiphyseal plates have closed, acromegaly is going to result. So acromegaly again occurs in adults. Here we'll have a widening of the hands and the feet and other body parts as well. No linear growth. Next then, let's talk hyposecretion. Now in children, it's going to result in pituitary dwarfism. It'll result in pituitary dwarfism. So here we can see we've got a young man with dwarfism, another young man with gigantism, and then a normal female. Let's talk then TSH. Let's talk thyrotropin. Now, TSH or thyrotropin is a hormone that stimulates the normal development and secretory activity of the thyroid gland. The hypothalamic hormone TRH, thyrotropin releasing hormone, triggers the release of TSH from thyrotropic cells of the anterior pituitary. GHIH will also inhibit TSH secretion. Then we'll see TSH is going to make its way over to the thyroid gland, and it's going to help release thyroid hormones. So we can see its release is triggered by thyrotropin releasing hormone from the hypothalamus, and it's going to be inhibited by rising blood levels of thyroid hormones that are going to act on the pituitary and the hypothalamus. And we'll see GHIH is also going to inhibit TSH secretion. So here we could see the hypothalamus will release TRH. TRH is going to make its way over to the anterior pituitary, where it's going to stimulate TSH's release. TSH, we said, is going to make its way over to the thyroid gland, where it's going to allow for thyroid hormones to be released. Thyroid hormones then will target their own target cells. So here then we can see thyroid hormones are going to inhibit their own release by targeting the anterior pituitary and the hypothalamus. Next in here, let's talk ACTH, Adrenocorticotropic hormone, also known as corticotropin. Corticotropin is going to be released by the corticotropic cells of the anterior pituitary. ACTH we'll see is going to stimulate the adrenal cortex to release corticosteroid hormones, like glucocorticoids. They're going to help the body to resist stressors. Next, then we can see CRH, corticotropin releasing hormone. Corticotropin releasing hormone is going to be the hypothalamic hormone that's going to elicit ACTH's release. And we can see next external and internal factors such as fever, hypoglycemia, and stressors of all types trigger CRH's release. Next, then we have our gonadotropins. When we talk gonadotropins, they're going to regulate the function of our gonads, our testes, and our ovaries. In both sexes, gonadotropin releasing hormone, GnRH, produced by the hypothalamus, elicits gonadotropin release from gonadotropic cells of the anterior pituitary. Gonadal hormones are going to feed back to suppress FSH and LH. Next in here we can talk about our gonadotropins. Our gonadotropins include FSH, follicle stimulating hormone, and LH, luteinizing hormone. They're going to be secreted by the gonadotropes, we'll see. They're going to regulate the function of the gonads, our testes and our ovaries. In both sexes, gonadotropin releasing hormone GnRH, produced by the hypothalamus, elicits gonadotropin release from gonadotropic cells of the anterior pituitary. Gonadal hormones feed back to suppress FSH and LH. So let's talk first FSH. FSH, or follicle stimulating hormone, in both sexes, it's going to stimulate the production of gametes, sperm or eggs. Next, then we have luteinizing hormone, LH. Luteinizing hormone in females, it triggers ovulation and it promotes the synthesis and release of ovarian hormones. In males, we'll see LH stimulates the interstitial cells of the testes to produce testosterone. Next then we can see we have prolactin. Prolactin. When we talk prolactin, prolactin is going to be produced by prolactin cells of the anterior pituitary. It's a hormone that's going to stimulate milk production by the breasts. We can see prolactin's release is controlled by an inhibitory hormone. It's called prolactin inhibiting hormone, or PIH, also known as dopamine. And it's going to prevent prolactin secretion. Decreased PIH is going to lead to a surge in prolactin's release. We can see blood levels are going to rise towards the end of pregnancy. The suckling reflex, The suckling reflex from the baby is going to stimulate prolactin's release, and it's going to promote continued milk production. Hypersecretion causes inappropriate lactation, a lack of menses, infertility in females, and impotence in males. Let's move over to the thyroid gland. When we talk about the thyroid gland is going to be found located in the anterior neck, on the trachea, just inferior to our larynx. The thyroid gland is going to be the largest pure endocrine gland we have in the body. Internally, we'll see the gland is going to be composed of hollow spherical follicles. The walls of these cells are formed by follicular cells, which are going to be a type of cuboidal or squamous cell, which produces the glycoprotein thyroglobulin. This glycoprotein is a protein that has a carbohydrate attached to it. The central cavity, or the lumen of the follicle, it stores colloid. Colloid is going to be an amber-colored, sticky material that's made of thyroglobulin molecules with attached iodine atoms. Thyroid hormone is going to be derived from this iodinated thyroglobulin. The thyroid gland, we'll see, also has parafollicular cells. They're going to produce calcitonin, which we'll talk about in a few minutes. Let's talk then thyroid hormones. So here let's look at the thyroid gland. Then macroscopically you can see on the trachea, just inferior to the larynx, in the anterior neck region. Under the microscope then we can see here, we've got a whole bunch of follicles. And these follicles are made up of follicular cells, we said. And next to them are the parafollicular cells that produce calcitonin. So in here is where we have our colloid. Let's talk more then about thyroid hormone. Now we talk thyroid hormone is going to be the body's major metabolic hormone. Thyroid hormone is actually two iodine-containing amine hormones, thyroxine, or T4 it's also known as, and triiodothyronine, or T3 it's also known as. T4 we'll see is going to be the major hormone secreted by the thyroid follicles, but T3 is the more active hormone. Most T3 is going to be formed at the target tissue by the conversion of T4 to T3. The difference between these two is one iodine atom. T4 has 4 iodine atoms, while T3 has 3 iodine atoms. Thyroid hormone enters its target cells. It's going to bind to intracellular receptors and makes its way to the cell's nucleus and initiates transcription of mRNA for protein synthesis. So some of the major effects of thyroid hormone include, as we can see here, to increase our basal metabolic rate, body heat production, regulating tissue growth and development, and maintaining blood pressure. So by knowing these effects of thyroid hormone, we'll see we're going to be able to come up with some signs and symptoms in patients who have too much or too little of this thyroid hormone. Next then, let's talk about the synthesis of thyroid hormone. So what we'll do is we'll skip this slide here and this slide here, and we'll go right into this slide here. And from here, we'll be able to go through and talk about all the different steps it's going to take to get to thyroid hormone. So step 1, we can see here, thyroglobulin is going to be synthesized and discharged into the follicle lumen. After being synthesized on the ribosomes, thyroglobulin is going to move to the Golgi apparatus. Here then, at the level of the Golgi apparatus, we've seen eventually it's going to get packaged into a vesicle, where then it's going to be moved out of the cell and into the follicle's lumen, becoming then tyrosines. Next then we can see here, iodide is going to get trapped. Iodide comes via our diet and into our blood. From here, it's trapped inside the follicular cell and then moved into the lumen. So here we can see step 3. Iodide is going to be oxidized to iodine, taking us to step 4. In step 4, we'll see iodine is going to be attached to our tyrosines. And the attachment of two iodines produces DIT, or diiodotyrosine. And in step 5, we'll see the iodinated tyrosines are going to be linked together to form T3 and T4. Two DITs linked together form a T4, and linking an MIT and a DIT forms T3. So we can see here step 6 then. In step 6, thyroglobulin colloid is endocytosed and combined with a lysosome. And in step 7, we can see lysosomal enzymes are going to cleave T4 and T3 from thyroglobulin, and then the hormones are going to diffuse from the follicular cells into the bloodstream, as we can see right down in there. So next time when we talk transport, you'll see T4 and T3 are going to be transported by TBGs, thyroxine binding globulins. Both will bind to target receptors, but again, T3 is 10 times more active than T4, and peripheral tissues can convert T4 to T3. Next then, let's move to calcitonin, and then we'll come back and we'll talk hyper and hyposecretion. Now we talk calcitonin. Calcitonin is going to be released by the parafollicular or the C cells of the thyroid gland, and it's going to be released in response to an increase in blood calcium levels. Calcitonin doesn't have any known physiological role in humans. However, at high doses, calcitonin inhibits osteoclast activity and the release of calcium from bone matrix. It also stimulates calcium uptake and incorporation into the bone matrix. All right, next then let's check out imbalances of thyroid hormone. Overactivity and underactivity of the thyroid gland can cause severe metabolic disturbances. Hypothyroidism will be the first one we'll talk about. Hypothyroidism is a disorder in which there isn't sufficient thyroid hormone. It may result from thyroid gland defects, if the thyroid gland has been surgically removed, inadequate iodine uptake, or secondarily from inadequate TSH or TRH release. So when we talk hypothyroidism in this patient, then what we're going to see is if we come back and we visit the functions of thyroid hormone, here we can see thyroid hormone is going to be a major metabolic hormone. It increases our metabolic rate and heat production. So here we can start with the patient having too little thyroid hormone. We can see their metabolic rate then is not going to be increased. So they're going to have a slow metabolic rate. And heat production, they won't have heat production. These patients will feel cold all the time. And then when you talk maintenance of blood pressure, these patients will usually have low blood pressure. Next then, let's talk hyperthyroidism. In hyperthyroidism, you'll see this is a disorder in which there is too much thyroid hormone. So if we have too much thyroid hormone, now let's see, our thyroid hormone is going to increase metabolic rate. So if we have too much, the metabolic rate is going to be even faster. Heat production is going to be much higher. So these people are going to have a high metabolic rate. So here you can see now in hypothyroidism, since you have a low metabolic rate, this will usually cause your weight to be increased. Now here, with metabolism being increased, this will cause the patient's weight to be a little bit underweight. With an increase in the metabolic rate, this will cause these individuals to be a little bit skinnier. But then also at the same time, with this increase in the metabolic rate, they're going to tend to eat more and gain a little bit more weight there as well. So you won't necessarily have every single patient being of a lower weight category. Okay, so heat production, they're going to be feeling hot all the time. So then we talk maintenance of blood pressure. The maintenance of blood pressure is also going to be increased. Next, then let's talk myxedema. Now, we talk myxedema. Myxedema is going to be a full-blown hypothyroid syndrome. It's a full-blown hypothyroid syndrome, and symptoms are going to include a low metabolic rate, feeling chilled or cold, edema, constipation, lethargy, and mental sluggishness. So here you can see it's a hyposecretion of thyroid hormone in adults. Next, then we have goiter. Goiter is going to be an enlarged, protruding thyroid gland. It can occur in hyper or hypothyroidism, in either one. Next, then we have cretinism. Cretinism is going to be severe hypothyroidism in infants. The child will have intellectual disability and a short stature. This condition can be caused by a genetic deficiency of the fetal thyroid gland or by maternal factors such as a lack of dietary iodine. And then last we have Graves' disease I'd like to talk about here. When we talk Graves' disease, this is going to be the most common hyperthyroid pathology. It's an autoimmune condition where a person's body makes abnormal antibodies which are going to be directed against thyroid follicular cells and their receptors. Instead of marking some cells for destruction as antibodies normally do, these antibodies are going to mimic TSH, and they're going to continuously stimulate TSH's release, causing there then this hypersecretion of thyroid hormone. And then we can also see this condition exophthalmos in patients where we have a bulging of the eyes. So this young man here in picture A has a goiter, and then this young lady here is exhibiting exophthalmos, where you have a bulging then of the eyes. Next, then let's talk about parathyroid glands. The parathyroid glands are going to be tiny yellow-brown glands that are going to be found on the posterior aspect of the thyroid gland. The number of glands varies from individuals. Anywhere from 4 to 8 of these tiny glands can be found embedded in the posterior aspect of the thyroid, but more commonly 4 are going to be found. The parathyroid glands contain 2 types of cells. The first type are oxyphil cells, where the function's quite not well understood. And the second type are parathyroid cells, which are going to be responsible for secreting parathyroid hormone. Let's talk then parathyroid hormone. Parathyroid hormone, or you'll see it's also known as parathormone, is going to control calcium balance in the blood. Low blood calcium levels are going to trigger PTH's release, and rising calcium levels inhibit its release. PTH increases calcium by stimulating 3 target organs. So here we can move forward. So here it's telling us, here it's showing us. So here we can see PTH increases calcium by stimulating 3 target organs. Number 1, we can see here the skeleton is going to be targeted. Here PTH is going to activate. Here we can see PTH is going to activate osteoclasts, and osteoclasts break down bone. And when they break down bone, they're going to release calcium and phosphates into the blood. The second way is PTH is going to enhance the reabsorption of calcium in the kidney's tubules. And then third, PTH promotes the kidney's activation of vitamin D, which increases calcium absorption from food. So it works with the intestine to help increase the absorption from food. So here we could see the same thing. Hypocalcemia, low blood calcium levels. It'll trigger the release of PTH from the parathyroid glands, which then increases osteoclast activity, helping to increase calcium. Also increases calcium reabsorption in the kidney tubules, also helping to increase calcium. And PTH, we can see, increases the activation of vitamin D by the kidneys, which increases calcium absorption from food in the small intestine, again helping to increase calcium. So let's talk then homeostatic imbalances. Then we have what we call hyperparathyroidism and hypoparathyroidism. Hyperparathyroidism is due to a tumor. And what's going to happen here is bones will soften and deform. Here we'll see elevated calcium depresses the nervous system. Also, it contributes to the formation of kidney stones. Now, in hypoparathyroidism, this occurs following gland trauma or removal or dietary magnesium deficiency. It results in tetany, respiratory paralysis, and even death. Next, then, let's check out our adrenal glands, our suprarenal glands. Now, we talk about our adrenal glands, they're going to be found as a pair. They're pyramid-shaped organs that are found on top of the kidneys. So suprarenal is where that comes from. Structurally and functionally, they are two glands in one. First, here we'll see we have the adrenal medulla. The adrenal medulla is going to be found making up the central part of the adrenal gland, and it's going to contain nervous tissue, and it's considered a part of the sympathetic nervous system. Next, then we have the adrenal cortex. The adrenal cortex is 3 layers of glandular tissue that are going to synthesize and secrete corticosteroids. So here let's check out that adrenal cortex in greater detail. The 3 layers of cortex produce different corticosteroids. First, we have the zona glomerulosa. That's going to produce mineralocorticoids. Our zona fasciculata is responsible for producing glucocorticoids. And then our zona reticularis produces gonadotropins. So here let's appreciate all the different layers. So first we've got the medulla, the deepest layer. And then outside of that we've got the zona reticularis. External to that, the zona fasciculata. External to that, then the zona glomerulosa. So that's the most superficial layer. And then external to that, you can see you've got a capsule. So zona glomerulosa first, fasciculata next, reticularis third, GFR. And then you got your medulla. So let's look at these layers then in greater detail. Let's start with the zona glomerulosa. Now, when we talk zona glomerulosa, we're going to be talking about mineralocorticoids. So let's talk then. Mineralocorticoids are going to be produced by the zona glomerulosa. Mineralocorticoids are going to regulate the electrolyte concentration in the extracellular fluids, particularly of sodium and potassium. Aldosterone is going to be the most potent mineralocorticoid, and it accounts for about 95% of the mineralocorticoid produced here by the zona glomerulosa. Aldosterone, or Big Al like I like to call it, is going to reduce sodium excretion at the distal kidney tubules, and it stimulates sodium reabsorption and water retention accompanied by potassium excretion. So it stimulates sodium reabsorption and water retention by the kidneys and the elimination of potassium. So if we stimulate sodium reabsorption and water retention, what this is eventually going to do is it's going to help increase blood pressure. I want you to think of the big picture. It's going to help increase blood pressure. Blood pressure is going to go up. When water levels go up, blood pressure goes up. The quickest, fastest way for me to increase your blood pressure, besides yelling pop quiz if we were in a class, is to hook you up to an IV. So if I put fluid into your circulatory system, this is going to increase blood pressure. And here, when we increase water retention, this increases blood pressure. So let's check aldosterone out then in greater detail. So we can see aldosterone's release is triggered by decreasing blood volume and decreasing blood pressure. So if we have a decrease in blood volume or a decrease in blood pressure, this triggers aldosterone's release. You know why now. And if we have rising blood levels of potassium, also triggers aldosterone's release. You know why. So here, let's check this out then in greater detail. So here we have our renin-angiotensin-aldosterone mechanism that you need to know about. This mechanism influences both blood volume and blood pressure by regulating the release of aldosterone and therefore sodium and water reabsorption by the kidneys. So we can see when we have a decreased blood pressure, this will stimulate our kidneys to release renin, which triggers the formation of angiotensin II. Now that's all going to happen because of renin converting angiotensinogen to angiotensin 1. And then angiotensin 1 getting converted to angiotensin 2 thanks to ACE, angiotensin converting enzyme, which comes from the endothelial cells of the lungs. So then we can see here, angiotensin 2 is going to be a potent stimulator of aldosterone's release. And then we saw everything aldosterone does. The first stimulus we can check out is going to be in relation to the plasma concentration of potassium. If we have increased potassium, this directly influences the zona glomerulosa cells to release aldosterone. ACTH causes small increases of aldosterone during stress. ANP, atrial natriuretic peptide, it blocks renin and aldosterone secretion to decrease blood pressure. So let's check this out here. We can see the primary regulators that are going to be controlling aldosterone's release include, again, decreased blood volume and or blood pressure, and also an increase in blood potassium levels, we said. So if we have a decrease in blood volume and or blood pressure, this will be sensed by the kidneys, which then are going to release renin, which helps form angiotensin 2, which is going to cause aldosterone to be released, which eventually increases blood pressure, as we mentioned. How? You've got to make sure you know that by increasing sodium and also water retention. And then when we have an increase in potassium in blood, we said that aldosterone is going to help to excrete potassium. So we can see here, we're going to have an increased potassium excretion. Stress, we can see causes ACTH levels to increase, which are going to cause blood pressure and blood volume to go up. And if we have increased blood pressure and or blood volume, now here we can see this is going to be an inhibitory effect. And it's going to shut this whole system down, not allowing blood pressure or blood volume to go up because we've already got an increase in blood pressure. Next, then let's check out aldosteronism. Aldosteronism is a hypersecretion due to adrenal tumors. Now, this can cause hypertension and edema due to excessive sodium. Excretion of potassium can lead to abnormal function of neurons and muscles. Next, then let's move to glucocorticoids. Glucocorticoids are going to be produced by the zona fasciculata, and they influence the energy metabolism of most body cells, and they help us to resist stressors. Cortisol is going to be the main glucocorticoid that I need you to know about. Cortisol's release is promoted by ACTH. Cortisol's primary metabolic effects is to provoke gluconeogenesis and enhance the sympathetic nervous system's vasoconstrictive effects. So by provoking gluconeogenesis, you can see it's going to help keep our blood glucose levels relatively constant, and then maintaining blood pressure by increasing the action of vasoconstrictors. So cortisol or hydrocortisone is going to be the main one. It's the only one found in significant amounts in humans. There are two others as well, cortisone and corticosterone. So let's talk more about cortisol. Cortisol is the main glucocorticoid I need you to know. Cortisol's release is promoted by ACTH, we said. So here we can see more information in regards to cortisol. Next, then, let's talk about some pathologies. Cushing's disease and Addison's disease. So, Cushing's disease first. Cushing's disease is going to be caused by increased glucocorticoids. Increased glucocorticoids can be caused by a pituitary tumor releasing ACTH. And we can also have Cushing's syndrome. That has many causes. That can include pituitary tumors, lung cancers, pancreatic cancers, or even kidney cancers. In Cushing's syndrome and Cushing's disease, you can have a depressed cartilage and bone formation. It also inhibits inflammation. It depresses the immune system and disrupts cardiovascular, neuro, and gastrointestinal function. Next, then, with Addison's disease. In Addison's disease, we have decreased glucocorticoids and decreased mineralocorticoids. Here you can see you have a hyposecretion of glucocorticoids, and it also involves a deficit in mineralocorticoids, a decrease in mineralocorticoids as well. Now here in Addison's, these patients have a decrease in glucose and sodium levels. They also experience weight loss, severe dehydration, and hypotension. So here then we can see a patient with Cushing's syndrome. So here's the patient before the onset. And here we can see the patient with Cushing's syndrome. Here they've developed a buffalo hump is what we refer to it as, a characteristic buffalo hump. And it's just a fat deposition on the upper back. So next then let's talk about our gonadotropins, our adrenal sex hormones. Now they're going to be produced by the zona reticularis. Most gonadotropins secreted by the cortex are weak androgens, and they can get converted to testosterone and estrogen. And here we'll see these weak androgens, their exact role is not well understood, but these weak androgens may contribute to the onset of puberty. These weak androgens are involved in the appearance of secondary sex characteristics. These weak androgens are involved in the sex drive in women. And last here we can see these weak androgens are going to help produce estrogens in postmenopausal women. Next, then let's move to the adrenal medulla. Now, when we talk about the adrenal medulla, it synthesizes catecholamines, epinephrine, and norepinephrine via tyrosine and dopamine. Epinephrine, we're going to see, is going to be the more potent stimulator of metabolic activities. It's also used clinically as a heart stimulator and to dilate bronchioles during acute asthmatic attacks. So here we can see the effects include vasoconstriction, increased heart rate, increased blood glucose levels, and causing blood to be diverted to the brain, heart, and skeletal muscles. Next, we can see the adrenal medulla's response is brief. And here when we talk epinephrine, epinephrine specifically stimulates metabolic activities, bronchodilation, and blood flow to skeletal muscle and the heart. When we talk norepinephrine, norepinephrine influences peripheral vasoconstriction and blood pressure. And here let's look at short-term and long-term response to stress. So let's look at our short-term response to stress. Here we can see when stress comes in, we're going to send then nerve impulses to our spinal cord, and the spinal cord is going to send then impulses via the preganglionic sympathetic fibers to our adrenal medulla. The adrenal medulla then is going to secrete amino acid-based hormones, catecholamines basically, our epinephrine and norepinephrine. Now here during our short-term stress response, what happens is you can see heart rate increases, our blood pressure increases, our bronchioles will dilate, our liver will convert glycogen to glucose, our liver will convert glycogen to glucose and release that glucose to the blood so the glucose can be used for energy production. Blood flow changes. We have a reduction in digestive system activities and urine output, and our metabolic rate is going to increase. Now, when we talk prolonged stress, now during periods of prolonged stress, here we can see CRH is going to be released. Corticotropin releasing hormone gets released. CRH then is going to release ACTH. ACTH is going to target the adrenal cortex, and it'll cause the adrenal cortex to secrete mineralocorticoids and glucocorticoids. So if we look at the long-term response to stress, here we'll see the mineralocorticoids will cause our kidneys to retain sodium and water, and this is going to lead to then blood volume and blood pressure rising. So here we can see our glucocorticoids will cause our proteins and fats to get converted to glucose or broken down for energy. Our blood glucose increases and our immune system is suppressed, which then can lead to us even being sick. So you can see this is all a part of general adaptation syndrome and our response to stress. Next, then let's move to the pineal gland. When we talk about the pineal gland is going to be found in the diencephalon, and its main secretory product is going to be melatonin. So it's a small gland that's hanging from the roof of the third ventricle, the diencephalon, we can say, the epithalamus more specifically speaking. And it has pineal sites which secrete melatonin, and it's derived from serotonin. And we can see it's derived from serotonin. Melatonin may affect timing of sexual maturation and puberty, day and night cycles, physiological processes that may show rhythmic variations like body temperature, sleep, and appetite. And last, we believe it's involved in the production of antioxidant and detoxification molecules in our cells. Next, then let's move over to our other endocrine glands and tissues, and we'll talk first our pancreas. Now, when we talk about the pancreas is a triangular gland that's partly located behind the stomach in the abdomen. It's a mixed gland which is composed of both endocrine and exocrine cells. The pancreas contains tiny cell clusters called pancreatic islets, which are going to contain glucagon synthesizing alpha cells and the insulin synthesizing beta cells. Now, this is the endocrine component. The exocrine component we'll look at in the digestive tract is going to produce enzyme-rich juice for digestion. So let's focus back on the endocrine component. And again, alpha cells that are going to produce glucagon are going to be found in these islets, and beta cells that produce insulin are going to be found in these islets. And here then we can see these pancreatic islets, the alpha cells, and the beta cells. Same thing here. And here we can see on the outside the pancreatic acinar cells, the exocrine cells. Same thing here on the sides here as well. Next then, let's talk about glucagon. Glucagon causes the release of glucose molecules into the blood. The major target organ for glucagon is the liver, where it's going to promote the following. We'll see number one, it's going to cause the breakdown of glycogen to glucose. So we call that glycogenolysis, as we can see. And number two, we can see it's involved in the synthesis of glucose from lactic acid and non-carbohydrates. So gluconeogenesis, production of new glucose. And third, it causes the release of glucose to the blood by liver cells. All of these effects cause blood glucose levels to rise. So glucagon is going to help increase our blood glucose levels, as we said. Next then we have insulin. When we talk insulin, insulin functions to lower blood glucose levels, and it also influences protein and fat metabolism. So it lowers blood glucose levels. It's going to enhance membrane transport of glucose into fat and muscle cells. It inhibits glycogenolysis and gluconeogenesis. And it's going to participate in neuronal development and learning and memory. Insulin, we'll see, is usually required for the uptake of glucose. However, insulin is not going to be needed for glucose uptake in the liver, in our kidneys, or in the brain. So here we can see if we have imbalances, what will occur. So here we have normal blood glucose levels, but here we have an imbalance. The stimulus is that we have increased blood glucose levels. So if we have increased blood glucose levels being detected, the pancreas then is going to come into play. The pancreas is going to release insulin. Insulin then will do one of two things. Insulin stimulate glucose uptake by our cells to help decrease glucose levels, and insulin can stimulate glycogen formation, again to help decrease blood glucose levels. So either of those processes are going to decrease blood glucose levels, bringing it down to the normal range, which is about 90 milligrams per 100 milliliters. Now, if we have a stimulus that detects low blood glucose levels, again, we can see the pancreas will come into play. The pancreas now is going to be stimulated to release glucagon. Glucagon is going to stimulate glycogen breakdown. So when we break down glycogen, this releases glucose. And that glucose is going to be released to the blood. So blood glucose levels then are going to rise back to normal levels, and we go back into our balanced state. And then here we can check out some factors that will influence insulin's release. First, elevated blood glucose levels. That's a primary stimulus. And if we have rising blood levels of amino acids and fatty acids, also helps release insulin. Also cause insulin to be released. The release of acetylcholine by parasympathetic nerve fibers. We also have our hormones, glucagon, epinephrine, growth hormone, thyroxine, and glucocorticoids, which stimulate insulin's release. And then finally, somatostatin and our sympathetic nervous system. Next then, let's check out diabetes mellitus. Now, when we talk diabetes mellitus results from either hyposecretion or hypoactivity of insulin. When insulin is absent, the result is type 1 diabetes mellitus. Now, if insulin is present, but its effects are deficient, the result is type 2 diabetes mellitus. In either case, blood glucose levels remain high after a meal because glucose is unable to enter tissue cells. The three cardinal signs of diabetes mellitus are polyuria, polydipsia, and polyphagia, we can see right inside of here in the next slide. Polyuria, glucose is going to act as an osmotic diuretic, causing huge urine output. Next then is polydipsia, excessive thirst. That's obviously going to happen from our water loss due to our polyuria. Third, then we have polyphagia, which is excessive hunger and food consumption. We'll see the cells cannot take up glucose, so they're said to be starving. And this is the way of trying to replenish that. So moving back here, we can see a few terms I want you to be familiar with. First is glycosuria, where you have glucose being spilled into the urine. And next here, fats are used for cellular fuel. We refer to that as lipidemia.